adopting this net zero policy is putting a ceiling on our economic growth and strength at the wrong time in the wrong place right now.
National farmers have signed up to it, though. They're all for net zero emissions, and the meat industry is for net zero by 2030. So is it everyone else who's getting left behind?
I disagree vehemently with the National Farmers Federation position. I've done so for months. I would say that AgForce Queensland, the representative body that represents graziers and other farmers here in Queensland, did not sign up to that target. So there is dispute within the farming sector. The NFF try to say, well, the beef sector's reduced its emissions by half, so we can do the other half at some time soon. The problem is that half, as I said, that the 50% reduction in beef sector emissions has come from stopping farmers developing their own land. They are also policies the NFF's against. The NFF is against those restrictions on land clearing, yet they're happy to accept the emissions reductions as a result of policies they don't like. And their own members hate, I know that. So I find their position completely incoherent. I'm not a member of the NFF. In the Nationals Party, we've always been opposed to net zero emissions, particularly because we know this is just going to be a stalking horse for more red tape, more regulations on businesses that will especially affect farmers and those in regional communities with insecure work in factories or mines. You know, it's very easy for the laptop class to be sitting there working from home, trying to expect others to bear the brunt of their moral guilt. When the rubber hits the road, it's the jobs lost in mines and factories and regional areas that will occur, and we're not going to cop that kind of outcome for our people and our constituents.
But doesn't agriculture have more to gain from the transition than any other sector? You've got carbon storage and producing food without emissions. You've got Twiggy Forrest, who's kind of leading the way at the moment with his seaweed feed that reduces methane by some 80%. I mean, so do you accept that the agriculture industry has more to gain from this?
We've heard all this before. As I said, we heard the same things in the last 20 years, that Kyoto wouldn't hurt farmers, that there'd be all these wonderful, fantastic benefits. And, you know, as often with government promises, they sound good when they're emitted, so to speak, but they don't follow up on the delivery, particularly over decades. So I don't have the trust that those sort of things would actually withstand budgetary pressures and other things over many decades. It'll be farmers are left with the can while governments move on from their initial promises. I mean, to put this in context, the CSIRO 2 years ago, Peter, the CSIRO estimated that to meet net zero, we'd have to start with a carbon price of $30. It would grow to over $200 a tonne. Each cow emits 2,300 kilograms of CO2 a year. So even an average size cattle producer of 1,000 head would be up for 70 grand a year to start with, and then the bill would be rising. Now, that's the cost of doing these things, and someone's got to bear that cost. And now, so governments come along and say, we'll bear the cost for you, but I have no trust that that would last over many decades. Okay,
so you're not on board the path to net zero by 2050. Is there anything that would convince you to get on board? What part of the negotiations are you going to want, the Nat's going to want?
Well, what negotiations? I mean, there's nothing on the table. As I said, we had a mandate at the last election to oppose net zero emissions. The Minister Taylor that came out opposed to it and criticised it, using those CSIRO numbers that I just mentioned to you. The Labor Party took a net zero emissions by 2050 target to the last election. They lost. We have a mandate not to implement that. So I'm sticking consistent with the election platform that the coalition government was elected on. And if there's a change in policy, well, that certainly hasn't been presented to the joint party room or the Nationals party room that I'm a member of.
Okay, what about this new development today? It's on the front page of The Australian. ANZ Bank has abandoned its coal export port in Newcastle because of its climate policy. What's your thoughts on that? And, you know, is that another example of big business moving in a certain direction, which is opposite of what you're saying?
Well, there's no doubt it is. I mean, the big businesses and elite of this country, as I say, the laptop class in this country, are deserting the support for Australian workers and Australian small businesses that rely on this sort of infrastructure in regional areas. I mean, Newcastle's our biggest port by tonnes on the eastern seaboard, and for an Australian bank to walk away from our biggest port in the eastern seaboard just, you know, beggars belief. what's going on in this country that we're not supporting our own assets, our own infrastructure. This port is half owned by a Chinese investor. And what I'm most concerned about is the desertion of Australian banks, of Australian interests, will only drive, though, that infrastructure into the hands of overseas investors, possibly Chinese investors. And that's especially short-sighted. Because as I've said over the last couple of weeks, whatever you think the policy of emissions should be by 2050, the much, much bigger and more pressing task for us right now is responding to rising Chinese aggression in our region. And why would we walk away from one of our nation's biggest ports, in the context of that environment? Look, it's not unexpected. I mean, you look at the projections for coal use out of Newcastle. Some will say, coal use is on the way down. The projections in the paper today from IHS show that by 2050, Newcastle is predicted to get back down to the level it exported in 2015, and that was just after the port doubled. I mean, there's so much demand here in our region for our high-quality thermal coal. It's just such a shame that Australian banks won't back Australian businesses. Okay.